Welcome everyone to the Catalyst Wellness Alliance monthly AAPI Pastors Gathering for Asian American pastors around the country. We do these sessions to help equip and give a safe place for pastors and ministry leaders in churches to engage with mental and holistic health. Today, we're grateful to be joined with David Wu, who is the co-founder and executive director of Mosaic Formation. He's a graduate of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a senior faculty member of SELA, a leadership transformation program in spiritual direction. And previously, he's been in overseas missions, church planting, and pastoral ministry. And he's passionate about creating prayerful and hospitable space for others to listen to God, serving underserved individuals and communities, and biblical reconciliation and peacemaking. He's coming to us from Houston, Texas today, and he'll be speaking to the topic of spiritual direction and giving us a great introduction. David, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your life and experiences with us today.
Thank you, DJ. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this gathering, and I really enjoy talking to people and about the subject of spiritual direction. Probably even more so than talking about it or training spiritual directors is actually meeting with leaders. As DJ introduced, my wife Cindy and I we co-founded Mosaic Formation in 2021. This was after several years of doing local church ministry and also spiritual formation, parachurch ministry. My wife was also actually doing nonprofit work in the area of refugee ministries. And in 2021, the call of God was irresistible to start a new ministry. And our focus, our mission is to expand access to spiritual formation care and training for leaders that are working with and serving underserved and marginalized communities. We get to do a variety of different kind of ministry services. We teach workshops pretty frequently. We do some teaching and training for ministry leaders in areas like spiritual formation or intercultural agility. We also frequently are facilitating retreats. But out of all the things that we get to do in ministry, I would say by far the one thing that is the most life-giving and gratifying for me personally is when I get to meet one-on-one with ministry leaders for spiritual direction. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to share some slides, and I'm looking forward to having more discussion with y'all later. But just what is spiritual direction? And not a definition, but maybe an example of a story in which you kind of see spiritual direction happening is the story of Samuel. As a young child, being woken up at night, to a voice calling his name. The boy initially misunderstands the voice. He thinks it's Eli calling him, and so he goes to Eli. He's like, "Eli, did you call me?" And then he says, "No, just go back to sleep." And this happens a few times, and then on the last time, Eli recognizes, "Oh wait, I think this is the Lord," and so he instructs Samuel to return, and if it happens again, then to respond, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." And I share that just to kind of give a picture, because every time before I start a spiritual direction session with another person, we open with a very simple prayer in the beginning, where we say, "Lord, we humbly ask that you would help us to hear your voice today. And so speak, Lord, your servants are listening." And then the rest of the session is really just it's an hour typically of dedicated space to try to listen and to pay attention to how God is present and how God is speaking and how God is at work in another person's life. I think before I go further, it might be helpful to actually distinguish a couple of phrases. A lot of times people, when you first hear the word spiritual direction, sometimes it's used interchangeably with spiritual formation or spiritual disciplines. And so I'm just going to give some simple description of what these terms are meaning. Spiritual formation is a very broad term. And this is the definition that we came up with that we feel like is a helpful one. It's not just a process, it is actually more a lifelong journey. When you say it's a process, then it sounds like it's linear, but spiritual formation is very much the arc of our whole journey, our story, our life with God. So we say it's the lifelong journey of being transformed by the love of God, the Father, into the image and likeness of Jesus. It's through the power of the Holy Spirit so that we can love God and others. Okay, hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. But I love this definition because it's not just about the fruits or the results. It's really this is a process that happens. This is a journey that happens in the context of a relationship of love and intimacy with God. Okay, spiritual disciplines. All right, and how does that relate with spiritual formation? We like to say that these are the intentional and the regular practices that we engage in with a desire to create space for God to do this forming work in us. Okay, and spiritual direction then is one of the practices, is an example of a spiritual discipline, and it's a practice in which, with another person, we call that the spiritual director. We pay attention to the triune God in this formation work. What happens to the directee? They're growing and learning and responding to God in an ever more intimate relationship of love. Okay. All right, so that's definition-wise. What I've recognized is that definitions don't always really make something real or necessarily motivate us to do something. So one of the things that we talk about spiritual direction and how it relates to other models of companionship. And I'm going to compare spiritual direction to some other models of companionship that are probably more familiar to you all and other people. So for example, counseling is an example of a kind of spiritual companionship, mentoring, coaching, discipling, right? So these are probably some of the other companionship types that we're accustomed to and are a part of the ministries that we are a part of. And what I'll do is I'll talk about what are some of the ways in which these other models are similar or different with spiritual direction. Okay, so let's start with counseling, or just counseling, more generally. I'm going to talk about, like, with each of these models, like when you enter into, let's say, a counseling relationship, who's the agenda set by, right? And what is the role of the helper? And what are some of the processes? Like, what does the helper do? What are some of the ways in which the helper is helping the person? And then we'll talk about, and then what is the overarching goal? And what are the type of questions that we are seeking the answers for within each of these models? Okay. All right. So with counseling, the agenda is usually set by the counselee or the client, right? Someone is coming and they are experiencing some kind of brokenness. Something is, there's a wound or there's a brokenness. Something is not working. They're not feeling whole. And so they come to the counselor, and the role of the helper is to facilitate healing. And you have in mind the goal. The goal of counseling is usually healing and wholeness, whether personally or relationally, right? But we're looking for healing and wholeness. And the process includes, but is not limited to, asking questions, trying to problem solve, exploring wounds, seeking to generate insights, and perhaps imparting strategies, right? The type of questions that the counselee or the counselor might be asking, hey, what do they need to know in order to be healed? Okay, so that's counseling. Let's move next to mentoring. Okay, there's some similarities with counseling, but the agenda can really be set by either the mentor or the mentee. The mentee can be seeking a mentor. They're just saying, hey, I would like to meet with you because I would like to develop some skills or to grow in knowledge about X, Y, or Z. But sometimes the agenda is set by the mentor. The mentor is saying, oh, wow, in my leadership, content, I'm trying to raise up leaders, and I see a young man or woman that I see has potential, and so I take them under my wing. Right? So the role of the mentor is to simply put is to equip the mentee, and the goal is for the mentee to become more like the mentor. And so some of the processes include things like there's instruction, there's imparting skills, you're passing on knowledge. Perhaps part of the process is modeling behavior. Okay? And so the underlying questions are, what do they need to know so that they can become more like the mentor? Next, let's talk about another model of companionship called coaching, right? And this is one that's become really popular and is getting a lot of traction and momentum in churches. And I love seeing, like within denominational groups, just a lot of energy, a lot of investment in coaching. And the agenda in a coaching relationship is set by the coachee. Right? The coachee seeks the coach. And where it's different from mentoring is that it's not necessarily around a mentor's area of expertise. Right? A coach can be a highly effective coach, even if they don't have deep knowledge or experience or expertise in a particular fields. The overarching goal of coaching is a coachee trying to achieve personal goals. So the goals can be spiritual in nature, they can be vocational in nature, but whatever it is, I have these goals. I'm trying to get from point A to point B, and for whatever reason, I feel stuck in getting to point B, and so I reach out to a coach who has a particular skill set that's going to help me move from A to B. So the role of the helper, the role of the coach is to facilitate progress, right? Try to make incremental steps, concrete steps towards the goal. And so some of the process will involve helping the coachee to clarify goals, helping them to generate insights, helping them to set specific and achievable action steps, celebrating wins with them, giving encouragement. Okay, so that's coaching. So the underlying question they're looking for is what does this person need to know so that they can achieve their goal? All right, so we've covered 3 so far. Hopefully these all feel familiar and you can kind of like, okay, yeah, you're seeing what's similar and how they're different. I'll do one more before I finally get to spiritual direction, okay? Discipling. All right. How is discipling similar or different from these other models. For discipling, the agenda is usually set by the discipler, right? The goal of discipleship relationship is to help another person to become a faithful follower of Jesus. And so the role of the helper, the role of the discipler is to facilitate spiritual growth. And in that way, it's important for the discipler to be the one who's setting the agenda. And so they're saying, okay, what does this person need to know to become a more faithful follower so that they can grow spiritually? It might include instruction, modeling behavior, perhaps holding the other person accountable, right? Suggesting practices to emulate. So the underlying questions is what do they need to know to grow spiritually? Okay. All right, so we've talked about 4: counseling, mentoring, coaching, and discipling. And now let's talk about the spiritual direction finally, okay? And here's where it's different. In the spiritual direction, where it's different from these other 4 models is that it is not outcomes oriented. So in counseling, your goal is healing and wholeness. With mentoring, it's acquiring skills and knowledge. With coaching, it's attaining a goal, achieving a goal. With discipling, growth in knowledge and spiritual maturity. Spiritual direction, the goal is deepening intimacy with God. Like the focus of an entire spiritual direction session with another person is their relationship with God. And the agenda is not set by the spiritual director. We like to say that it is actually set by the Holy Spirit, right? And the role of the helper is facilitating prayer. And the process then includes activities such as trying to notice God's presence, listening for how God may be speaking, inviting the directee to respond to what he or she is hearing. So I'll give you an example, of how it often feels very different. In spiritual direction, one of the things that's different from the other models is that in the other models, you're really looking for the helper to speak, to do a lot of the talking. Whereas in spiritual direction, oftentimes the most important part of a session is the silence. Silence in which the directee is actually just being present to God, just being still. As they're processing. And so sometimes I'll have a directee who will begin to share what's going on in their lives, what's going on in their hearts, within their emotions, their turmoil, or their joy and their celebration. And as a spiritual director, this is not primarily a conversation between me and the directee. And so what I might do is then I'll invite them, and is there anything that you've just expressed that you would like to tell God directly, right? So for example, it's like, is there anything that you've just shared that you have yet to actually talk to God about? And what's interesting is so many cases, and so most of my directees are pastors, missionaries, or nonprofit leaders. You'll be surprised at how much we talk about God, how much we talk about ministry, how much we think about it, but how much of that is not actually brought into intimate conversation with the Lord. And it's not like that doesn't mean that something's wrong. It's just kind of like that's our default. So when I say, have you talked to the Lord about that? It's not surprising that sometimes these pastors will say, well, actually, I haven't. And then my role is not to then get into an intellectual conversation of why not. I just simply say, well, would you like to right now? And then the directive was like, well, okay, sure. Okay. And then so they begin to talk to the Lord about whatever is really, you know, I was like, so express, what are your honest questions? What do you wish the Lord would talk to you about, would speak to you about? It's like, well, I really wish the Lord would say this. This is what I'm seeking guidance for. I was like, well, would you like to bring that to the Lord right now? And then after a moment of prayer, then a spiritual director might, for example, to then invite, well, before we go on, why don't we just pause for a little bit and let's give room for the Lord to respond. The Lord may or may not, but let's create the space for that to happen. Okay. And in all the years that I've been offering spiritual direction, I serve mostly people who love the Lord, are earnestly serving the Lord in ministry, but many of them are struggling with prayer. And one of the foremost reasons why even ministers and servants of the Lord will struggle with prayer at times is unresolved disappointment or anger with God. And spiritual direction is one of those companioning relationships that actually is very intentional and is so especially set up so that a directee can work through some of those underlying hurts, relational pain that they have with God. And it's just amazing, and I told you this is one of the things that I just enjoy so much, because when we create that space for some of these folks to just like sit with the Lord, get them to express their pain, their relational pain to God, and then I invite them to like, let's just pause for a moment and let's give the Lord the room to speak. And furthermore, I invite you to just try to notice the Lord. How do you imagine his countenance and his posture towards you after just hearing all that you've spoken to him? And inevitably, I can't even count the number of times where we hear stories, or I bear witness to, well, it's the strangest thing. I felt like when I was just sitting there quietly, I felt like the Lord was nearby and gave me an embrace. The Lord just assured me that of his love for me. I felt loved. And those moments are so transformative, so powerful. I can't even, like adequately describe it. And that's why I love doing this so much. It's like I get to listen in on an intimate exchange between the Lord and his beloved children. Right? And a lot of ministers who are burned out, many of them who are struggling and wanting to call it quits. The main source of the problem is not always just emotional wounds or the stresses of the ministry. Even underneath that is there's something going on in their relationship with God, right? And so that's why I these days I don't. These days we are getting so many requests from ministry leaders who are looking for a spiritual director. I think it's really more recent in recent years that we're starting to see a surge of awareness and interest in spiritual direction. And let me say this too. I think that all of these models are important. I think we need all of these gifts in the body of Christ. I'm certainly not one to say that, if counseling doesn't work, then meet with a spiritual director, right? In many ways, like we need all of these different different gifts, these in the body of Christ. I think I'll probably just pause at this point, and just let there be some space if anyone has like specific questions, for us to just even begin to discuss happy to talk more about spiritual direction. And I think later on, DJ will introduce you to a few ministries, including Mosaic Formation, that are offering, making it possible for ministry leaders to be able to pair and to find a spiritual director that they can meet with. All right.
Thank you so much, David, for giving us a great introduction to all the resources that we have as pastors and ministry leaders on the front lines of doing hard work. And it's to know that there are ministries like yours that provide the care and support that we need.
Mm-hmm.
While we do rely on God, God provides God's people to,
Yes.
like Aaron supported the arms of Moses and others throughout the Bible, but we just didn't have a name for it. And somehow in our post-Enlightenment age and other factors throughout history, we've um, just said all we need is Jesus and the Bible, and that's a little too oversimplistic. We need the body of Christ and companions to walk this journey. So let's open a space. We've got nearly half an hour to really make this interactive. So uh, feel free to either turn on camera, ask your question. If you want to raise your hand, you can do that, be a little more formal, or just type in the chat window and we can entertain your questions as well.
David, thank you so much for that early definition. That was critical for me because
Mm.
those words are all over the place, but you helped me understand that. Now, the question I have is, if someone's interested in getting training to be a spiritual director,
Yeah.
what is the guideline? What is is it a degree? Is it certification, cost, and how long does it take? If you could share that, that'd be helpful.
I would be happy to share that. Yeah. So, unlike like the world of counseling where you can have licensed counselors, there's not like a licensing body. So when you hear the term like a certified spiritual director, that's a little bit of a misnomer. There's not a credentialing body that is authorizing someone to be a certified spiritual director. That being said, there are training programs that will supply like a certificate. So a lot of times what people mean is like, I received a certificate of completion. And there are a number of training programs out there. The one that I teach in a couple of different ones. One of them is called SELA, and it's the certificate program for a ministry organization called Leadership Transformations, or LTI. And our program, similar to many other programs, are about 2 years. It's a 2-year program. I would say it's different from like it's not as academic. If you think about the nature of how I described spiritual direction, it's not that you read a lot of books, write a lot of papers, and read a lot and gain a lot of knowledge about spirituality, and then you can get a degree or you get a certificate. In a 2-year program, we're meeting with a spiritual director. You are meeting with a faculty supervisor, all right, as you are being trained. You attend, like in our program, you attend 5 in-person residencies. These are retreats that are usually 3 nights, 4 days in duration. So 5 of such retreats over the course of 2 years. And in between the retreats, you are offering direction, you're receiving direction, you're receiving supervision, and you're completing assignments. I would say like a lot of the training is really more about spiritual formation, the way I talked about it earlier. So like, for example, I think for the longest time when I was in ministry, I really did not have a framework to understand that the spiritual life includes seasons of the soul in which we're not to be fruitful, right? that sometimes it is good and necessary for us to endure a season of like spiritual barrenness, right? Where there's not fruit growing on the trees, but this allows roots to go deep, right? And if you don't have a paradigm like that, then you're constantly fighting against the winter season when actually, rather than allowing the winter to do its work, so this is an example of like understanding some of the shape and the context, even within the biblical narrative of the reality of seasons, right, in the spiritual life. Wilderness, desert, spirituality. These are things that you get some education and learning about in spiritual direction training. I've seen some that are like a year and a half, some that are 3 years, but on average, a lot of the programs that we see are about 2 years. Okay. Cost. And again, that also varies. A 2 year program, I've seen them range on the less expensive side, on the $5,000, over 2 years. On the more expensive end, I'd probably say about $12,000, right? Average somewhere in the $7,000 to $10,000 range. And these are usually for programs that are doing where they have a online component, but also an in-person residential component. Okay. Our ministry is actually, we're starting to explore and trying to create avenues so that people can receive this kind of training for free. That's our dream. That's our hope. That's our funding. That's our financial model for Mosaic Formation. But I think the training and the learning and the growing in the work ministry of spiritual direction, it should be something that is available, without these kind of financial constraints.
Thank you, David. A question came in from Maggie. How is spiritual direction similar to or different from or overlapping with something called inner healing?
That's a great question. And there's a conversation about this in spiritual direction training, right? There is a lot of overlap because, as you can imagine, if spiritual direction is about the work of God in the child of God, that it is frequent, it is not unexpected that sometimes what the Lord wants to do is to do deep healing. And that deep healing is part of the pathway towards intimacy, greater intimacy with God. Okay. Now the difference is inner healing has within it, the goal is healing and wholeness. So I would draw comparisons to the counseling model of companionship, where we're in pursuit of healing, and this may involve like inner healing prayer, kind of like doing deep exploratory work of one's brokenness and one's wounds. In spiritual direction, however, we might also be seeing what is God up to, and is God's intention to always heal? Or could sometimes the Lord's intention to not heal us yet, right? When you have an outcomes-oriented spirituality, you become really focused on how do I become healed? But when spiritual direction, which is really trying to facilitate a relationship-oriented spirituality, then we can experience deeper intimacy with God when He heals us, but also when He does not heal us. And actually, sometimes the most profound spiritual depth and places of intimacy is when we are yet in the waiting, or when we are, we are still continuing to experience sorrow and suffering. Okay, so that's how I would kind of talk about that.
Wow, that is so countercultural because we're in a very results-oriented world.
Absolutely.
Inside the world and even inside the church. And what you've introduced to us is a relationship orientation because we're children of God and God is trying to make us more like
Hmm.
Christ.
That's
Okay,
right.
another question from David. Thank you for your presentation. My questions are two of them. How can spiritual direction be used to serve Asian American Christians specifically? And secondly, what suspicions or resistances to spiritual direction have you noticed in your ministry?
Oh, these are great questions. Okay. So I think that spiritual direction it just applies across all cultures. Like in whatever culture background we come in, we have our culture has impacted, whether we want to admit it or not, whether it's conscious or unconscious, it has shaped our image of God, right? And and I find like with many who come, some of the Asian Americans that I get to serve, they have many of them have had difficulty perceiving God as friend or God as intimate lover, as God as being tender, as being affirming. You know, like a lot of times we know the right things to say about God's character, but subconsciously, our operative image of God is that God is a cosmic tester who's kind of watching to see, are we going to do right and do good? And if I hope my child's going to do right. And if he does, then I move towards you. And then if you let me down or you disobey, then the Lord withdraws or the Lord is like disappointed. Right? And I'm also sharing this. This is also like for decades, right? Even in as a pastor in ministry, this was actually an image of God that was quite dominant, and it really impaired my relationship with the Lord. And we could talk more and more about that. And then in other cultures, people are struggling with a different kind of operative image of God. But yes, yeah. So I think that I hope that's kind of getting a little bit to that. And then number two, suspicions or resistances to spiritual direction. There was for a period of time, people, I think because in evangelical and in Protestant circles, a little bit of a little bit of a guard up around spirituality that resembles anything that is Catholic or anything that touches on contemplative spirituality that is kind of mystical in nature. And so like sometimes by association, there's a little bit of a guard up. What do you mean by spiritual direction? But usually these people who have a guard up about it, it's not about the guard is not towards prayer. They wouldn't be resistant to the idea that greater, deeper intimacy with God is possible and that meeting with a companion might be able to help with that. So usually it's a little bit of a caution around other forms of spirituality that seem unfamiliar. Okay. But that being said, like I brought the example of like Samuel meeting with Eli, and I'm like, you know, and you look at all the examples in which how Jesus like accompanied and companioned people, right? How he accompanied the Samaritan woman, how he accompanied Nicodemus, how he accompanies like some of his disciples. We see all of these are all examples in which there are things that we can experience relationship that draw us closer in intimacy and love and in trust with God. You know, these days I'm very grateful to see that the guard has come down significantly. And I think now because we're starting to see spiritual direction programs pop up that are a little bit more grounded, like biblically, theologically, you know, that really are Trinitarian in their theology, are more anchored. And so you're starting to see a little bit more trust. And then with more exposure, I feel like it's improving a lot. The spiritual formation movement, you know, before that was also, there's a little bit of guard and resistance to that. I see that has also kind of calmed a bit as we're seeing even a lot of the major theological institutions right now are also starting to include spiritual formation tracks. They're starting to include, even training tracks in spiritual direction. I know one thing that I didn't mention is just like, what does it look like? Frequency, cost, things like that, right? So there can be variations to this, but I would say probably the most common way in which people experience spiritual direction is a 1 hour session at a frequency of about once a month. Okay, that's the rhythm and the routine. And that's the rhythm that I have with most of my directees. Once a month, and this can be in person. It can also happen over Zoom. In spiritual direction, similar to some other things like counseling, you'll find a lot of spiritual directors might charge fees for service. And so if you meet with a spiritual director, you might expect to pay anything in the range of $50 to $150 per session, sometimes less if they have a sliding scale. What I've noticed is that most spiritual directors do not want finances to be a hindrance for people to receive spiritual direction. One of the reasons why we formed spiritual Mosaic formation was we started to notice that these fees for service were often an obstacle for people who most needed spiritual care from receiving them, right? Isn't this kind of the same reason why so many people who need professional counseling are not actually receiving professional counseling? Is the financial obstacles, right? And that's one of the reasons why we form Mosaic Formation. And our funding model is a kind of an unconventional one. We call it freely receive, freely give, right? And so what we tell everyone is we don't charge fees for service. If we meet with you for spiritual direction, we invite you to freely receive it. We're able to do this because of the generosity of others who've already covered the cost for us to meet. Okay. But we invite you, if you would like to, if you want to join in the movement of generosity, we invite you, you're not obligated to give a gift to the ministry that will bless future others to also receive this gift. Okay. So it's really kind of like a pay it forward model. And I'll just share that within a few months of us starting Mosaic Formation, we were inundated with requests for services, and we have been able to serve a lot of groups and individuals who previously did not have access, or were not even, it wasn't even on their radar because they just kind of automatically assumed that they couldn't do that. And I'm so encouraged to find out that there are some other ministries now that are forming, and they're adopting this generosity model when it comes to finances. And we're really hoping that there can be a movement to make spiritual direction way more accessible than it has even historically been in the last several years.
Thank you, David, for explaining that. Some of the nuts and bolts help our viewers and listeners to get their head around this new category of really caring for people at a spiritual and a companion level. And we have a spiritual directors directory at the Catalyst Wellness Alliance, and we'll add a link in the follow-up email and with this video so that you can share that. And we want to provide, Catalyst Wellness Alliance wants to provide all kinds of resources for thriving, spiritual formation, spiritual direction, counseling, therapy, coaching. So we're building all that to really create that ecosystem, especially for Asian American Christians because of our need and our context. So in the few minutes we have to wrap up, or if there's any last minute questions, it's okay. We can just wrap up early if there are no questions from the audience. I know David and I could talk for hours because we've met on a few occasions. So we'll pause for just a little bit, see if there's other questions from our audience. I know David, as a trained spiritual direction person, you're very good at pausing and waiting in the silence.
Very comfortable with
Okay,
silence. Yeah.
one one last question. Okay, thank you, Maggie. Can you repeat the definition of spiritual formation? And did you say this is different than spiritual direction?
Yeah. Yeah. Spiritual formation is the lifelong journey of being transformed by the love of God the Father into the image and likeness of Jesus through the power of the Holy Spirit so that we can love God and others. Okay. So all of us are a part of that, right? We're all part of this journey, and we're being transformed by God's love. And we're part of that transformation is that we start to look like Jesus. We start to bear his virtues, his character. This is not something that we do through the power of the will. It's something that happens through the power of the Holy Spirit within us, right? And this is not just for the sake of these fruits that we enjoy. You know, it eventually leads to our love for God and our loving others, and then so we can fulfill the great commandment. Okay. Spiritual direction is a particular kind of type of relationship, companionship model that in which we is a specific practice in which we with someone else with a spiritual director pay attention to how God is doing this transformative work within us. It's a spiritual relationship. It's a relationship that really focuses on nurturing and cultivating our relationship of intimacy with God.
Thank you for repeating that. And Maggie and everyone attending, as well as those watching this video, we will have a link connected to the video and the follow-up email, and also now in the chat window that has a handout of everything that David presented today. So you have the definitions, you have the comparison models of the various companionship relationships that can help you to go farther and healthier in your life journey.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being with us today, and I'm going to hand the mic to Jen Lee to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. This has been very enlightening and very drawn to it personally, and much needed in our work that we're doing to bring wellness to our Asian pastors. So, you know, Callus Wellness Alliance doing these monthly is really to equip our Asian pastors in the area of mental health and spiritual wellness. And so we really believe in it because we know that many pastors are doing a lot of ministry alone. And I think that's the hardest part of ministry. And we want to share that you're not alone. We have others. We want to equip you. And so we would love to have communication from you. How can we help you more? What are some topics that DJ and I can bring to the surface? What are some needs that you're going through that we could try to provide? Not that we can answer everything, but at least we could start addressing it slowly. Also, you know, this is not a one-man show kind of thing. We would love to partner with other in there that wants to be part of this movement and say in volunteer service or expertise or guidance or connection. So we love to see that, and you can reach to DJ and he'll manage that. But thank you, David, for this. It's personally really insightful in an area of we've been focusing a lot on mental health, but you've brought in a perspective that is very needed and talking through. And so thank you for enlightening us, organizing the thoughts for us, putting words to ideas that we had. And so that really was helpful for me. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.